Southern California, 1980. Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old single mother, lived a life defined by routine and quiet resilience. Her world revolved around her 4-year-old son, her job at a local health food store, and the unwavering support of her parents. Each day was a careful balance of work, love, and the simple rituals that brought her peace. In the sprawling suburbs of Orange County, Sarah blended in, just another hardworking mom seeking safety and stability, but beneath this calm, nothing hinted at the darkness about to invade her carefully built world. Sarah's peace was shattered by a faceless tormentor, an unknown man who called her home, turning the phone into an instrument of terror. He knew her routines, her clothes, even her son. Proof he was watching. The calls were relentless, each one more threatening, each detail more chilling. In 1980, there was no caller ID, no easy way to trace him. The police were sympathetic but powerless. Even after changing her number, the calls continued, as if he was always one step ahead. Sarah was trapped, her sanctuary breached, her fear growing with every ring. Fear became Sarah's constant companion. Every phone ring, every unfamiliar car sent her heart racing. The stalker's threats grew more personal. He knew about her son, using that knowledge to torment her. Sarah fought back by documenting every call, every threat, hoping her logbook would one day bring justice. Outwardly, she tried to maintain normalcy, but inside, she was unraveling. The terror was relentless, her world shrinking, her sense of safety gone. She had no idea the stalker's patience was ending, and that a simple act of kindness would soon change everything. The stalking was calculated, a campaign of psychological warfare. Each call, each detail was a reminder that Sarah was never truly alone. In 1980, stalking wasn't recognized as a crime. The law offered little protection. Isolated and exhausted, Sarah clung to her logbook. Her only weapon, her silent plea for help. The stalker had hijacked her life, turning routine into terror, home into a prison. She hoped her careful records would one day expose the man in the shadows. May 28, 1980. Sarah attended a work meeting, a small disruption to her routine. When a colleague was bitten by a black widow spider, Sarah volunteered to drive him to the hospital, stopping first at her parents' house to check on her son. There, she changed her headscarf from black to red, a small, fateful detail. For a brief moment she was surrounded by family, safe. Then she stepped back into the night, unaware it would be her last. Her stalker, always watching, may have seen this as his moment. The red headscarf would become a haunting symbol of a life interrupted. The drive to UC Irvine Medical Center was filled with the anxious energy that accompanies any medical emergency. Sarah navigated the Orange County freeways through the darkness, her focus on getting David to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible. The car was a small bubble of concern, the conversation likely centered on David's condition, the pain he was feeling, and reassurances that everything would be all right. For her two colleagues, Sarah was a calm and steady presence, a good Samaritan who had put their needs before her own. They were grateful for her generosity, completely unaware of the private terror that had been her constant companion for months. In that car, she was not a victim. She was a rescuer, a friend in a time of need. They arrived at the bustling emergency room just after 10 p.m. The bright, sterile lights of the hospital were a stark contrast to the dark night outside. Sarah and her other colleague waited patiently as David was triaged and treated by the medical staff. The hours ticked by in the uncomfortable chairs of the waiting room, a space where time seems to slow down and stretch out. They likely made small talk, read old magazines, and watched the sad, quiet drama of the emergency room play out around them. For Sarah, this long wait was another delay, another few hours keeping her from her son, but her sense of duty held her there. Her act of kindness was not a fleeting gesture. It was a commitment she intended to see through to the end. Finally, at around 11:30 p.m., a doctor informed them that David had been treated, and his prescription was ready to be filled at the hospital pharmacy. The immediate crisis was over. A collective sigh of relief likely passed between the three colleagues. The spider bite had been dealt with, and soon they could all head home. They walked together from the waiting area toward the main entrance of the hospital, the long, unexpected ordeal seemingly at its conclusion. The plan was simple. Sarah would go get her car from the sprawling parking lot while her two colleagues waited by the curb at the patient pickup area. It was a logical, efficient way to end the night. "You guys wait here, I'll bring the car around," Sarah said, her words echoing with a normalcy that was about to be shattered. Her colleagues watched as she walked away, a familiar figure heading out into the dimly lit parking lot. It was the last time they would ever see her. This simple instruction, this final act of consideration, was the moment that separated her from the safety of her friends. It was the moment she walked, alone, into the darkness. She was completely unaware that this simple act of kindness had placed her squarely in the crosshairs of a predator who had been patiently waiting for just such an opportunity to strike. The watcher was no longer just watching. The minutes stretched on as David and his colleagues stood by the curb, the cool night air settling around them. They waited, expecting to see the familiar headlights of Sarah's white Toyota station wagon cut through the darkness of the hospital parking lot at any moment. At exactly 11:47 p.m., their expectation was met. A pair of headlights appeared, approaching the emergency room entrance. It was her car, there was no doubt. They could make out the distinct shape of the 1973 station wagon as it drew closer. They stepped forward from the curb, ready to open the doors, climb in, and finally head home. The long, strange night was over, or so they thought. But as the car neared the pickup zone, something was terribly wrong. The vehicle wasn't slowing down. Instead of gliding to a gentle stop beside them, the station wagon seemed to gain speed. The driver was a silhouette, a dark shape behind the wheel, impossible to identify in the fleeting glare of the overhead lights. For a split second there was confusion. Was Sarah playing a prank? Did she not see them? The thoughts barely had time to form before the car raced past them, its engine revving as it accelerated away from the hospital entrance. It swerved sharply and sped out of the parking lot, disappearing into the vast darkness of the Orange County night. Stunned silence. David and the other colleagues stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching the red taillights of Sarah's car shrink into the distance until they were gone. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only the ambient noises of the hospital and the profound, ringing quiet of their confusion. Where was she going? Why would she leave them there? The scene made no sense. It was a complete betrayal of logic, a bizarre and unsettling end to an evening that had been defined by Sarah's steadfast kindness. They tried to rationalize it, searching for any plausible explanation. Maybe she had a sudden family emergency. Maybe she had forgotten something. The possibilities they considered were all rooted in a world that still made sense. But as time passed and she did not return, a cold dread began to replace their confusion. They called the police, but as the brief explained in 1980, a 32-year-old woman driving away in her own car did not constitute an emergency. She was an adult, free to go where she pleased. The authorities suggested they wait, that she would likely turn up in the morning with a perfectly reasonable story. But her colleagues and you and I know the horrifying truth. Sarah Mitchell wasn't driving that car. Somewhere between leaving her friends and starting the engine, the watcher in the shadows had made his move. The final drive was not one of her choosing. She had vanished, swallowed by the night, her fate sealed by a predator who had finally closed his trap. The evening of May 28, 1980, began with the soul-crushing boredom of a mandatory company meeting. For Sarah Mitchell, it was just another obligation to get through, another hurdle before she could return to the warmth and safety of her son's world. The air in the health food store was probably thick with talk of sales figures and new inventory, a world away from the silent terror that had been gripping her life for months. She sat there, a portrait of composure, her mind likely a million miles away. To her colleagues, she was the same quiet, dependable Sarah. No one could have known that beneath her calm exterior, she was a woman living on a razor's edge, constantly looking over her shoulder for a threat she could feel but never see. The mundane drone of the meeting was a temporary anesthetic, a brief respite from the fear that was her constant shadow. Then, a sudden sharp cry shattered the monotony. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. One of Sarah's co-workers, a man we are calling David, had been bitten by something. In the ensuing confusion, the culprit was discovered. A black widow spider, its telltale red hourglass a small venomous warning. Panic spread through the room like a contagion. A spider bite of this nature was no small matter. It was a genuine medical emergency requiring immediate attention. In that moment of chaos, as David's face contorted in pain and his arm began to swell, Sarah's true nature shone through. Her own anxieties, her own fears were pushed aside by an overwhelming wave of compassion. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and offered to help, her voice a calming presence in the rising tide of alarm. Her offer was a lifeline. She volunteered to drive David to the nearest hospital, a simple, selfless act that was entirely in character for her. Another co-worker, concerned for both David and Sarah, decided to accompany them, adding another layer of perceived safety to the impromptu trip. The decision was made quickly, born out of necessity and kindness. The company meeting was abruptly forgotten, its importance paling in comparison to the immediate crisis at hand. Sarah, the woman who had been so methodically hunted, so psychologically tormented, was now stepping into the role of protector, of rescuer. It was a cruel and tragic irony that her inherent goodness would be the very thing that led her into the heart of the danger she had so desperately tried to avoid. The plan was set. The three of them would leave immediately for UC Irvine Medical Center. For Sarah, this meant another delay, another unexpected turn in a life she tried so hard to keep predictable and safe. But for her stalker, the man who had been patiently watching and waiting, this sudden disruption was something else entirely. It was a gift. It was an unforeseen opportunity, a crack in the routine he had studied so intensely. He had been waiting for a moment when she would be vulnerable, a moment when she would be separated from her usual patterns of protection. A simple act of kindness, born from the venom of a spider, was about to become the catalyst for a far more potent and deadly poison. The night was no longer ordinary, it was now charged with a terrible new potential. Before they could race to the hospital, Sarah knew she had to make one crucial stop. Her son was at her parents' house, and she couldn't simply disappear for hours without letting her family know what was happening. Her maternal instincts were as powerful as her compassion. So she steered her white Toyota station wagon not towards the freeway, but towards the quiet suburban street where her parents lived. This detour was a brief, necessary pause in the unfolding emergency. It was a moment to reassure her family, to check on her sleeping child, and to ground herself in the familiar before plunging back into the uncertainty of the night. This stop was a testament to her responsible nature, a small, practical act that would later become a significant piece of the puzzle. She pulled up to the house that was her anchor, her safe harbor in the storm of her life. Inside, she likely moved with a quiet urgency, explaining the situation to her parents in hushed tones so as not to wake her son. She probably tiptoed into his room, the love for him a physical ache in her chest, and placed a gentle kiss on his forehead. In that moment, she was just a mother, her world reduced to the sleeping face of her child. It was during this brief stop that she made a small, almost insignificant change. She went into her old room and swapped the black headscarf she had been wearing for a vibrant red one. Perhaps the color felt brighter, more hopeful, or perhaps it was just a random choice. But this simple piece of red fabric would become an iconic, heartbreaking detail in the story of her disappearance. The change of headscarf was a fleeting personal moment, a tiny act of self-expression in a life that was increasingly controlled by an outside force. It was a splash of color, a final assertion of her own identity before she was swallowed by the darkness. After reassuring her parents and promising to call with an update, she walked back out to her car, where her two colleagues were waiting. She was re-entering the role of the capable caregiver, the one in charge of the rescue mission. This brief stop at her parents' house was a moment caught between two worlds, the world of love and family she was leaving behind, and the world of chaos and danger she was driving towards. It was the last time she would ever be in a place that felt truly safe. As she pulled away from the curb, leaving the warm glow of her parents' home behind, she was unknowingly driving towards a meticulously laid trap. Her stalker, the architect of her fear, knew her routines with an obsessive precision. He would have known about the company meeting. He would have been watching, waiting. The unexpected trip to the hospital was a deviation, but the stop at her parents' house put her right back on a predictable path. It gave him time. It gave him a location. Every move she made, even those born of love and responsibility, was inadvertently leading her closer to the man who was determined to make this night her last. The red headscarf was not just an accessory, it was a beacon, marking her for the predator who hunted her in the shadows. The drive to UC Irvine Medical Center was a tense journey through the dark arteries of Orange County. Sarah was at the helm, her hands steady on the wheel of her Toyota station wagon, her focus entirely on the mission at hand, getting David the medical help he desperately needed. The atmosphere inside the car was thick with a mixture of pain, anxiety, and gratitude. David was likely moaning softly, the spider's venom doing its insidious work, while the other colleague offered words of comfort. Sarah, for her part, was a pillar of calm strength. She navigated the roads with a quiet efficiency, her own deep-seated fears momentarily suppressed by the urgency of the situation. To her passengers, she was a hero, a selfless friend who had dropped everything to help them. They had no idea they were sitting beside a woman who was living through her own private horror film. They arrived at the emergency room shortly after 10 p.m., a chaotic world of bright lights, antiseptic smells, and human suffering. The triage nurses acted swiftly, whisking David away for treatment. For Sarah and her other colleague, the adrenaline of the initial crisis gave way to the slow, agonizing crawl of time in a hospital waiting room. They found chairs, picked up worn-out magazines, and settled in for the long haul. The minutes bled into hours. They probably spoke in low voices, speculating on David's condition, replaying the bizarre events of the evening. For Sarah, every tick of the clock was another moment she was away from her son, another moment her parents were waiting for a call. The weight of her responsibilities, both chosen and thrust upon her, must have felt immense. The waiting room is a strange limbo, a place where life is stripped down to its most basic elements: fear, hope, and patience. Sarah sat in that sterile environment, surrounded by strangers, each nursing their own private anxieties. Did her own fears begin to resurface in the quiet moments? Did the thought of her stalker creep back into her mind? Or was she so focused on her friend's well-being that her own terror was kept at bay? We can never know. We can only imagine her there, a picture of quiet endurance, her red headscarf a single point of warmth in the cold, impersonal room. She was performing an act of profound normalcy, waiting for a friend, while her life was anything but normal. Finally, around 11:30 p.m. the news came. David had been treated, the danger had passed, and his prescription was ready to be filled at the hospital pharmacy. A wave of relief washed over the small group. The ordeal was finally at an end. They collected the medication, the small paper bag a symbol of their victory over the night's unexpected turn. Together the three of them walked towards the glass doors of the hospital entrance, ready to leave this place of sickness and worry behind them. The plan was simple, logical, and efficient. Sarah would retrieve her car from the vast, dimly lit parking lot while the others waited at the curb. It was a perfectly ordinary end to a very extraordinary night. No one could have predicted that this simple, practical suggestion would be Sarah's final act. "You guys wait right here," Sarah likely said, her voice carrying the weariness of the long night. "I'll bring the car around." Her two colleagues watched her walk away from the bright lights of the hospital entrance, a familiar silhouette against the shadowy expanse of the parking lot. They saw her merge with the darkness, just another person heading to their car. They stood by the curb, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stuffy waiting room. They talked, maybe with a sense of relief, the tension of the past few hours finally beginning to dissipate. They were tired, ready for their own beds, and grateful to Sarah for her unwavering kindness. They were waiting for the familiar sight of her white station wagon to emerge from the rows of parked cars. At precisely 11:47 p.m., their wait was over. Headlights cut through the gloom, the unmistakable boxy shape of Sarah's 1973 Toyota approaching the patient pickup area. It was happening exactly as planned. They stepped forward, ready to pull open the doors and sink into the seats for the ride home. The car drew closer, its headlights momentarily blinding them, but in that instant a primal sense of wrongness took hold. The car wasn't slowing down, it wasn't gliding to a gentle stop. The hum of the engine was growing louder, more aggressive. Instead of decelerating, the vehicle was accelerating, hurtling towards them with an unnerving purpose. It was a terrifying, incomprehensible sight. In the driver's seat, a figure was visible only as a dark shape, a phantom behind the wheel. There was no wave, no sign of recognition. Before David or his colleague could even process what was happening, the station wagon roared past them. It didn't just pass them, it swerved around them, as if they were obstacles in its path, its tires squealing on the pavement. The car sped away from the hospital entrance, racing through the parking lot with a reckless abandon that was completely alien to Sarah's careful driving. They stood there, frozen in a state of shock and disbelief, as the white Toyota disappeared out of the parking lot and onto the main road, its red taillights shrinking into pinpricks before vanishing completely into the night. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the low hum of the hospital's machinery. The scene replayed in their minds, a surreal and disturbing loop. Why? Where was she going? Why would she abandon them like that? They tried to conjure logical explanations, a sudden urgent phone call she had to take, a family emergency she had just remembered, but none of it felt right. The speed, the aggression, the complete lack of acknowledgement, it didn't add up. The person behind the wheel had not been their friend Sarah. They were left standing on the curb, not with answers, but with a terrifying, gut-wrenching question. Who was driving Sarah's car? For long, agonizing minutes, David and his colleague remained on the sidewalk, their minds struggling to catch up with the reality of what they had just witnessed. They scanned the dark road where Sarah's car had disappeared, half expecting the white station wagon to reappear, for Sarah to pull up with a sheepish grin and a perfectly reasonable explanation. But the road remained empty. The night offered no answers, only a profound and unsettling silence. The initial shock slowly curdled into a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The image of the car speeding away was burned into their minds, a chilling final frame to their evening with Sarah. Their faith in a logical explanation began to crumble. They made their way back into the emergency room, the sterile environment now feeling hostile and alien. They used a payphone to call the police, their voices trembling as they tried to explain the bizarre sequence of events. But as the brief has told us, their report was met with a frustrating bureaucratic calm. In 1980, a 32-year-old woman was considered a free agent. She owned the car. She was not a child. There was no obvious evidence of a crime. The police dispatcher likely suggested they wait it out. Perhaps she had an argument with a boyfriend. Perhaps she just needed some time to herself. They were advised to go home and see if she turned up in the morning. Eventually, with no other options, they called a taxi. The ride home must have been silent and heavy, the two of them lost in their own confused and fearful thoughts. They were the last people to have seen Sarah, and the last thing they saw was her car being driven away by an unknown person, leaving them stranded in the middle of the night. They were witnesses to her disappearance, the final, crucial moments before she was completely swallowed by the night. They were carrying a piece of a puzzle they couldn't solve, their simple act of accepting a ride now transformed into a burden of guilt and confusion that would likely follow them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the trap spring shut, but they had been powerless to stop it. As they tried to sleep, Sarah's family was also waiting. Her parents were waiting for the phone call she had promised, a call to say she was on her way home. Her son was sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware that his mother was not coming home that night or any night after. The night everything changed was not a loud, explosive event. It was a quiet, insidious one. It was the moment a predator who had been patiently honing his plan for months finally saw his opening. He didn't need to break down a door or shatter a window. He simply stepped into a moment of chaos and kindness and took what he had convinced himself was his. Sarah Mitchell had vanished, not into thin air, but into the waiting darkness, driven away by a phantom who had finally made his move. The hours immediately following the bizarre incident in the hospital parking lot were a thick fog of confusion and disbelief. Sarah's two colleagues, left stranded on the cold pavement, waited until nearly 1 a.m., clinging to the fading hope that she would return. Every pair of headlights that approached sent a jolt of anticipation through them, only to be followed by another wave of disappointment. The rational mind fights hard against the unthinkable, and they cycled through every possible logical scenario. A sudden illness, a forgotten urgent errand, a terrible misunderstanding. Each explanation seemed flimsier than the last, unable to account for the chilling image of the car accelerating recklessly into the night, abandoning them without a word. Eventually, the harsh reality set in that she was not coming back. They hailed a taxi, the silent ride a stark contrast to the concerned chatter that had filled Sarah's car on the way to the hospital. They went home, but sleep offered no escape. Their minds were a chaotic loop of the night's events, replaying the moment the familiar white station wagon transformed into a vessel of menace. They were the sole witnesses to the critical moment Sarah's life veered off its predictable course, the moment she transitioned from a person into a puzzle. They carried the heavy burden of that final, inexplicable image, a memory that would haunt them with questions they could not answer. Meanwhile, at her parents' house, another quiet vigil was taking place. Sarah's parents waited for the phone to ring, expecting to hear their daughter's voice letting them know she was safe and on her way. As the late hours ticked by, their concern grew from a small flicker into a gnawing worry. It wasn't like Sarah to be so inconsiderate, to fail to call when she knew they would be waiting up for her. Their anxiety was a mirror of her colleagues' confusion. Two separate groups of people connected by their love for Sarah, all staring into a void of silence, completely unaware of the terrifying truth that bound their experiences together. The sun rose on the morning of May 29th, casting its bright, cheerful light on a world that now felt deeply wrong. When Sarah failed to arrive to pick up her son for the day, and when she didn't show up for her morning shift at the health food store, the lingering threads of hope finally snapped. The cold hard fact could no longer be denied or rationalized away. Sarah Mitchell, a devoted mother and a reliable employee, hadn't just driven off in a hurry. She hadn't just decided to take an impromptu trip. She had vanished. The mystery had officially begun, and the first 24 hours would be a frantic, desperate scramble for answers that were nowhere to be found. At 8:30 in the morning on May 29th, Sarah's frantic parents made the call they had been dreading. They reported their daughter missing to the local police department. The responding officer arrived and began the methodical, dispassionate process of police work, taking down the essential details. Name, Sarah Mitchell, age 32, last seen UC Irvine Medical Center, vehicle, a white 1973 Toyota station wagon. The questions were standard procedure, designed to quickly assess the situation. Did she have any known enemies? Was she experiencing financial trouble or marital problems? Had she been acting depressed or unusual in the days leading up to her disappearance? Her family answered as best they could, their words choked with fear and anxiety. It was then that her family revealed the detail that ripped the case out of the realm of the ordinary and plunged it into the sinister. They told the officer about the phone calls. They explained the months-long campaign of terror waged by an unknown man, a faceless stalker, who had systematically dismantled Sarah's sense of security. They described his unnerving knowledge of her daily life, from the routes she drove to the clothes she wore. Most importantly, they told him about the threats, the graphic, chilling promises of violence and death that had been whispered to her through the telephone receiver. Suddenly, this was no longer a simple missing person case. This was potentially an abduction, and very likely a homicide. The information about the stalking changed everything. It provided a dark and terrifying context for the bizarre events her colleagues had witnessed at the hospital. The phantom at the wheel of her car was no longer just a random figure. It was likely the man from the phone calls, the watcher who had been lurking in the shadows of her life. The investigation immediately shifted gears, gaining a new and terrible urgency. Detectives were assigned to the case, and the search for Sarah and her white station wagon became a top priority. The police now understood they were not just looking for a missing woman, they were hunting for a methodical and dangerous predator. What elevated this case beyond even a typical stalking scenario was the existence of physical evidence. Sarah's family told investigators about the logbook she had kept. Her meticulous handwritten record of the harassment was a godsend for law enforcement. It was a direct line into the mind of the stalker, a chronicle of his escalating obsession. The dates, the times, the exact horrifying quotes, it was all there. This notebook transformed the vague, terrifying threats into concrete evidence. It was a voice for Sarah speaking from her absence, telling the story of her fear. Investigators now had a chilling blueprint of the psychological warfare that had preceded her vanishing. The search for Sarah's white Toyota station wagon was the first critical step for investigators. An all-points bulletin was issued, and police departments across Southern California were on the lookout for the vehicle. For 3 agonizing days, there was nothing. Sarah's family and friends waited by the phone, praying for good news but fearing the worst. The absence of the car was as unsettling as the absence of Sarah herself. It was the last place she was known to have been, a rolling crime scene that held the potential key to unlocking the entire mystery. Every passing hour that the car remained missing felt like another grain of sand slipping through the hourglass of hope. Then on the 3rd day, there was a break. A patrol officer spotted the station wagon. It was found parked in the sprawling lot of a shopping center in Anaheim, a city about 15 miles north of the UC Irvine Medical Center. The location was significant. It was public, busy, and anonymous, a perfect place to abandon a vehicle without drawing immediate attention. The car was not hidden or damaged. It was simply parked alongside dozens of other cars, as if its owner had just popped into a store. But the moment police ran the plates, they knew they had found the ghost car that had sped away from the hospital 3 nights earlier. Crime scene technicians descended on the parking lot, cordoning off the area around the Toyota. What they found inside was both revealing and deeply frustrating. The car was unlocked, and the keys were still dangling from the ignition, a detail that suggested a hasty departure. On the front passenger seat sat Sarah's purse. Her wallet was inside, and a quick check confirmed that the $80 in cash she was known to be carrying was still there. Robbery, therefore, was not the motive. This was something far more personal. But the one item investigators had desperately hoped to find, the vibrant red headscarf Sarah had changed into at her parents' house, was conspicuously absent. The most chilling discovery was what they didn't find. The vehicle had been meticulously wiped clean. Forensic teams dusted for fingerprints, but the steering wheel, the gear shift, the door handles, all the places a driver would have touched, were barren. It was a clear and deliberate effort to erase any trace of who had been in the car after Sarah. This was not the work of an impulsive or sloppy criminal. This was the calculated action of someone who understood the basics of a police investigation and had taken careful steps to cover their tracks. The abandoned car was a dead end, a tauntingly silent witness that offered plenty of questions but not a single, solid answer. Just as investigators were grappling with the sterile dead end of the abandoned car, the case took another terrifying turn. The stalker, not content with having abducted his victim, decided to escalate his psychological game. 2 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, the telephone at the health food store where she had worked began to ring. Her former colleagues, already traumatized and grieving, would answer, only to be met with a voice that sent a fresh wave of terror through them. It was him. It was the same cold, disembodied voice that had haunted Sarah for months. The watcher in the shadows had returned, this time to torment those she had left behind. His messages were no longer threats, they were chilling, taunting confessions. In one of the first calls, the man spoke with a calm, almost casual cruelty. "I killed her," the voice stated, devoid of any emotion. "She was my love, and I killed her." The words were a direct and brutal confirmation of everyone's worst fears. Sarah was not just missing, she was gone. The caller seemed to revel in his power, in his ability to reach out from the shadows and inflict more pain on the people who cared about Sarah. He was not just a killer, he was a sadist who enjoyed twisting the knife, ensuring that her friends and family had no peace, no hope to cling to. The calls to Sarah's workplace became a regular occurrence over the next few weeks, a new chapter in the campaign of terror. Sometimes the man would say nothing, simply breathing into the phone before hanging up, letting the silence itself be a form of intimidation. Other times he would make cryptic statements about her fate, dropping cruel hints and taking a perverse pleasure in the fact that her body had not been found. He was playing a sick game with the investigators and with Sarah's loved ones, dangling the promise of information while simultaneously withholding the closure they so desperately needed. Each ring of the phone was a fresh assault, a reminder that the monster was still out there, watching and enjoying their suffering. Detective James Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the case, immediately sought and received authorization to place a wiretap on the health food store's phone lines. It was their best and only hope of identifying the phantom caller. But the technology of 1980 was clunky and slow, and the stalker seemed to know its limitations perfectly. He was disciplined and maddeningly precise. He would speak for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough to deliver his venomous message, but not long enough for the trace to be completed, and then the line would go dead. He was a ghost on the line, a technological phantom who knew exactly how to exploit the system's weaknesses, staying one step ahead of the law at every turn. Months bled into a year, and then 2. The promising leads that had emerged in the first few weeks of the investigation had all grown cold, leaving behind a trail of frustration and unanswered questions. The wiretap on the health food store's phone eventually fell silent as the tormentor, having satisfied his cruel urges, stopped calling. The meticulously wiped-down station wagon offered no further clues. The logbook Sarah had kept was a chilling portrait of her fear, but it provided no name and no face to attach to the monster who had stalked her. The investigation, which had begun with such intensity, had ground to a halt. It had become a true dead end. For Sarah's family, the passage of time brought no relief, only a prolonged and agonizing state of limbo. Her son, who was just 4 when she vanished, was now 6. He grew older in a world without his mother, his childhood punctuated by the sad, unanswerable question, "When is Mommy coming home?" Her parents, who were supposed to be enjoying their golden years, were now raising their grandson, their lives consumed by the grief of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. They were trapped between the faint, flickering hope that she might one day walk through the door and the horrifying certainty that she never would. The lack of a body meant there could be no funeral, no grave to visit, no final closure. Detective Rodriguez and his team continued to work the case, but with no new evidence, there was little they could do. They re-interviewed friends, family, and colleagues, hoping someone might remember a small, seemingly insignificant detail that could break the case open. They chased down dozens of fruitless tips and investigated potential suspects who were ultimately cleared. The case file grew thicker with reports and dead-end leads, a testament to the immense effort expended with so little result. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance became one of those infamous local mysteries, a cautionary tale whispered about in the community, a ghost story that was all too real. The official investigation was effectively stalled, a victim of the technological limitations of the era and the killer's cunning. Without DNA evidence, without sophisticated phone tracing, and without a witness who could identify the man behind the wheel or the voice on the phone, police were powerless. The stalker had executed a nearly perfect crime, leaving behind a wake of devastation, but almost no tangible proof of his existence. It seemed as though he had simply melted back into the shadows from which he came, leaving Sarah's loved ones and the police with nothing but a profound and haunting silence. The mystery, it seemed, might never be solved. For 4 long years, the case of Sarah Mitchell remained frozen in time, a painful, open wound for her family, and a frustrating enigma for law enforcement. The trail had gone completely cold, the phantom caller had fallen silent, and the hope of ever finding answers had dwindled to a faint, flickering ember. Sarah's son was growing up, the memories of his mother slowly fading, replaced by the stories his grandparents told him. The world had moved on, but for those who loved her, time had stopped on that dark night in May 1980. The mystery had settled into the cold case files, a thick manila folder filled with dead ends, a testament to a crime that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, a perfect, chilling act of evil. But time, in its relentless march forward, has a peculiar way of unearthing secrets that have been intentionally buried. On a sweltering August morning in 1984, the silence was finally broken. In the remote, sun-scorched hills of Santa Ana Canyon, miles from the manicured suburbs of Orange County, a construction crew was clearing brush for a new development. As a worker kicked at the dry, dusty earth, he saw something white gleaming under the harsh desert sun. It wasn't a rock, it was a bone, and then another, and another. Scattered amongst the rocks and tangled vegetation were the unmistakable skeletal remains of a human being. The long, silent wait was over. The construction site immediately became a crime scene. Detective James Rodriguez, who had never given up on the case, was called to the location. The years of frustration and dead ends had taken a toll, but the discovery in the canyon reignited a flicker of grim purpose. As forensics teams carefully excavated the site, they collected the scattered fragile bones that had been bleached white by the sun and picked clean by the elements and scavenging animals. It was a somber and macabre puzzle, piecing together the last physical traces of a life that had been so violently stolen. There was an unspoken certainty among the investigators at the scene. After 4 long years, they had finally found Sarah Mitchell. The remains were carefully transported to the Orange County Coroner's Office, the final authority that could turn grim speculation into hard fact. The process of identification from skeletal remains is painstaking and methodical, but in this case, there was a clear path forward. Sarah's dental records, kept on file since the day she disappeared, were pulled from the evidence locker. The comparison was made, and the match was confirmed. The bones found scattered in that lonely, desolate canyon belonged to the 32-year-old single mother who had vanished from a hospital parking lot. The official notification was made to her family, a moment of profound and heartbreaking finality that brought both the agony of confirmation and the faintest glimmer of closure. With Sarah's identity confirmed, the focus of the investigation shifted from a missing person case to a full-blown homicide. The coroner's examination of the skeletal remains began to paint a brutal and horrifying picture of her final moments. The bones themselves, though weathered by 4 years of exposure to the harsh elements, held secrets. The forensic pathologist was able to determine the cause of death, and it was as vicious as the stalker's phone calls had promised. Sarah had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. The evidence on the bones pointed to a frenzied, violent attack, not the work of a cool, detached killer, but of someone consumed by a furious, personal rage. The nature of the wounds spoke volumes about the killer's mindset. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. The repeated stabbing was overkill, an attack fueled by a deep-seated hatred and a desperate need to dominate and destroy. It was a crime of passion, but a passion that was twisted and one-sided, born in the dark recesses of the killer's mind. The evidence on her remains aligned perfectly with the psychological profile of the obsessed stalker who had tormented her for months. He hadn't just wanted to kill her, he had wanted to annihilate her, to punish her for a perceived betrayal that existed only in his own delusional fantasy. The bones were telling the story of her murder, and it was a story of pure, unadulterated malice. But as the forensics team continued their meticulous examination of the burial site, they made another discovery that was both bizarre and profoundly sad. Mixed in with Sarah's bones were the smaller, more delicate skeletal remains of a small dog. Detective Rodriguez immediately contacted Sarah's family, who confirmed the heartbreaking detail. On the night Sarah disappeared, her beloved pet dog, a small terrier mix she adored, had also vanished from her parents' home. The killer's cruelty knew no bounds. He had not only murdered Sarah, but he had also taken the time to kill her loyal companion, a living creature that was a symbol of her gentle, loving nature. It was an act of supreme possessiveness, erasing every last trace of her life. The location of the grave itself was another crucial clue. Santa Ana Canyon was nearly 30 miles from the hospital, a remote and rugged area not easily accessible to the public. This was not a place one would stumble upon by accident. It was a carefully chosen dumping ground, a location selected by someone with intimate knowledge of the county's hidden, forgotten corners. The killer had chosen this spot precisely because he believed the remains would never be found, that Sarah would simply remain a ghost, a mystery forever. The discovery of her body was a stroke of luck for the investigation, but it also underscored the killer's cunning and his cold, calculated effort to get away with murder. He was not just angry, he was smart, and he was patient. Even with the discovery of Sarah's body and the confirmation of her murder, the investigation, once again hit a familiar wall. They had a victim, a cause of death, and a strong psychological profile of the killer, but they still had no name and no face. The case went cold again, for 3 more long, frustrating years. It seemed that Sarah's killer had succeeded, melting back into the anonymity of Southern California, a ghost who had committed the perfect crime. But sometimes, a killer's ego, his unquenchable thirst for acknowledgement, becomes his own worst enemy. He just couldn't stand that the world didn't know of his terrible power, his dark victory. In 1987, 7 years after Sarah's disappearance, the case cracked wide open in the most unexpected way. An editor at a major Los Angeles newspaper picked up his ringing phone. The voice on the other end was unnervingly calm, almost conversational, as if he were calling to report a minor traffic accident. "I killed that girl," the man said, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. "The one from the health food store, the one they found up in the canyon." The editor, a seasoned journalist, instantly knew this was not a prank. He signaled for a colleague to listen in and start a tape recorder, his heart pounding as he tried to keep the man talking. The caller seemed eager to talk, to unload the burden of his secret, but only on his own terms. He was confessing, but he was also boasting, laying out the twisted logic behind his horrific act. "She was my love," he continued, his voice taking on a possessive edge. "But I caught her cheating on me with another man. She denied it, but I knew. I saw them together. She broke my heart, so I had to kill her." This was the motive, the final piece of the psychological puzzle. It confirmed the FBI's profile of a stalker living in a delusional romantic fantasy. Sarah hadn't been unfaithful. She had been completely unaware of the role she had been cast in within her killer's sick and twisted private drama. The man on the phone knew details that had never been released to the public, details only the killer could possibly know. He mentioned the red headscarf she was wearing that night. He talked about killing her little dog because it barked too much. He described the remote canyon where he had left her body with chilling accuracy. "She thought she could hide from me," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "But I was always watching. I knew everything." The call lasted for 4 minutes, an eternity in a phone trace attempt, before the line abruptly went dead. The editor immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez. They now had the killer's voice on tape, a direct confession from the ether, a ghost who had finally made the mistake of speaking his name, even if he hadn't realized it yet. The taped confession was a seismic breakthrough, injecting new life into the cold case. FBI behavioral specialists analyzed the recording, dissecting every word, every pause, every inflection. The profile they built was more detailed than ever. The killer was intelligent, methodical, and likely had a background that gave him surveillance skills. He was a narcissist who saw Sarah not as a person, but as a possession. His rage wasn't born of love, but of a profound sense of entitlement. When his fantasy was threatened by her perceived independence, her cheating, he felt he had no choice but to destroy her. The confession was not an act of remorse. It was an assertion of ownership, a final declaration that if he couldn't have her, no one could. But even with a voice on tape and a detailed profile, the technological limitations of the era proved to be a formidable obstacle. The call had been made from a payphone, and despite the 4-minute duration, tracing technology in 1987 was not sophisticated enough to pinpoint the exact location in time. The killer had once again exploited the system's weaknesses, using his knowledge to maintain his anonymity. For 5 more years, Detective Rodriguez and his team chased down leads based on the recording, playing the tape for hundreds of potential witnesses, hoping someone might recognize the calm, chilling voice. But every lead was a dead end. The voice remained a ghost, its owner's identity still shrouded in mystery. Then, in 1992, 12 years after Sarah had vanished, the final crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. A woman in her 50s contacted the Orange County Police Department, her voice trembling with a fear that had been simmering for over a decade. She said she had information about the Sarah Mitchell case. She'd been too terrified to come forward before, she explained, because her ex-husband had threatened to kill her if she ever spoke a word of what she knew. But now, years later, she had finally mustered the courage to break her silence, to unload the terrible secret she had been carrying for so long. The woman's story was a bombshell. She told investigators that her ex-husband had been pathologically obsessed with Sarah Mitchell. He had worked as a security guard, a job that gave him the freedom and opportunity to conduct his surveillance. He had followed Sarah for months, taking photographs of her from a distance, documenting her every move. He had built a shrine to her in their home. He had told his wife that Sarah was his true love and that he was going to rescue her from her sad life as a single mother. When she had confronted him about his terrifying obsession, he had become violent, confirming the rage that lay just beneath his calm exterior. She had divorced him shortly after Sarah's disappearance, living in fear ever since. The ex-wife gave investigators a name, and with it, the ghost that had haunted this case for 12 long years finally began to take on a solid form. The man's name was Michael Thompson, a pseudonym, but the key that would unlock everything. Investigators immediately delved into Thompson's background, and what they found was a perfect match for the profile they had been building for over a decade. Thompson had a military background where he would have received training in surveillance and intelligence gathering. He had the skills and the discipline to plan and execute a long-term stalking campaign with chilling precision. He knew how to watch without being seen, how to learn a target's patterns, and how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. His employment history was the final damning piece of evidence. Investigators pulled his work records from 1980 and discovered the fact that made the blood run cold. On the night of May 28th, the night Sarah vanished, Michael Thompson had been on duty as a security guard. His assigned post was a shopping center located less than 2 miles from the UC Irvine Medical Center. He had been there. He had been waiting. He had likely been monitoring her phone calls, knew about the company meeting, and when the unexpected spider bite created a chaotic opportunity, he was perfectly positioned to exploit it. The phantom at the wheel was no longer a phantom. It was Michael Thompson. With a named suspect, a motive, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, investigators prepared to finally make an arrest. The voice on the tape could be compared to Thompson's. His ex-wife's testimony provided the context for his obsession. Everything was finally falling into place. Justice for Sarah Mitchell, after 12 long, agonizing years, seemed to be at hand. Her family could finally face her killer in a court of law. Detective Rodriguez, who had carried this case in his heart for his entire career, was on the verge of closing the file on the murder that had haunted him more than any other. They had their man. But in the cruelest twist of all, the story took one last, frustrating turn. When the police went to locate Michael Thompson in 1992, they discovered that justice had been preempted by fate. Thompson had died 3 years earlier in 1989 in a single-car accident. The man who had terrorized Sarah, who had stalked her with a military precision, who had brutally murdered her and her dog, and who had taunted her loved ones and the police for years, had escaped all earthly accountability. He had taken his final secrets to the grave, cheating the justice system through pure random chance. The case was officially closed, solved but unprosecuted. Sarah's family had answers, but they would never truly have justice. The official closing of Sarah Mitchell's case was a hollow victory, a conclusion written in the footnotes of a tragedy rather than with the bold ink of justice. For 12 long years, her family and investigators had searched for answers, and when they finally arrived, they brought a bitter and unsatisfying form of peace. Knowing the name and face of the killer, Michael Thompson, provided a target for their grief and anger, but it did little to heal the profound wound his actions had caused. The knowledge that he had died not in a prison cell, but in a random car accident, felt like a final cruel joke played by a merciless universe. He had escaped judgment, not through intelligence or cunning, but through the arbitrary hand of fate, leaving behind an indelible echo of injustice. For Detective James Rodriguez, the resolution was the definition of bittersweet. This case had become a part of him, a constant presence in the back of his mind for over a decade. He had poured countless hours, his heart, and his career into finding the man who had stolen Sarah's life with such cold-blooded precision. To finally identify the perpetrator, to see how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together so perfectly, only to discover he was beyond reach, was a uniquely painful form of professional frustration. He had solved the mystery, but he could never secure the conviction. The file was stamped closed, but for the detective who had lived with Sarah's ghost for so long, the story would never feel truly finished. Sarah's family was left to navigate a complex emotional landscape. They had the truth, a truth they had desperately craved for years, but it was a truth stripped of any real catharsis. There would be no trial, no day in court where they could face the man who had destroyed their family and see him held accountable for his monstrous crimes. There would be no sentencing, no public declaration that what he did was wrong and deserving of punishment. Instead, they were left with the stark reality that their daughter's killer had lived for 9 years after her murder as a free man, his dark secret locked away, before dying on his own terms. The legal system had been cheated, and in turn, so had they. The story of Michael Thompson serves as a chilling reminder that evil does not always wear a monstrous face. He was a security guard, an ex-husband, a man who moved through the world cloaked in a veneer of absolute normalcy. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, his obsession festering beneath a surface that gave no hint of the violence he was capable of. His death by accident feels less like cosmic justice and more like a final cowardly escape. He never had to answer for the terror he inflicted, for the life he took, or for the family he shattered. The lack of a final confrontation, of a reckoning, leaves an unsettling silence where a verdict should have been. While true justice for Sarah Mitchell remained forever out of reach, her tragic story was not in vain. Her case, in its chilling detail and frustrating conclusion, became a powerful catalyst for change. The meticulous logbook she kept, the terrifying phone calls, and the methodical nature of her stalker's campaign served as a horrifyingly clear blueprint of a crime that the legal system was, at the time, ill-equipped to handle. Her murder cast a harsh spotlight on the serious and often deadly nature of stalking, forcing law enforcement and lawmakers to confront the reality that threatening behavior was not a trivial matter but a precursor to violence, a red flag that could not be ignored. In the years that followed, Sarah's story, along with others like it, helped fuel a movement. Advocacy groups and victims' rights organizations used her case as a prime example of why laws needed to be strengthened. The concept of stalking was more clearly defined in legal terms, and new legislation was passed across the country, making it a specific and serious felony. These new laws gave police the power they had lacked in 1980, allowing them to intervene earlier and more decisively. The development of anti-stalking statutes was a direct legacy of Sarah's ordeal, creating protections for countless future victims that she herself never had. Her life may have been stolen, but her story helped build a shield for others. The technological evolution that occurred in the decades after her death also changed the landscape of crime fighting. The frustrations of the 1980s, the inability to trace calls from payphones, the lack of DNA evidence, have been largely overcome. The advent of caller ID, sophisticated cell phone tracking, and advanced forensic science has given today's investigators powerful tools that Detective Rodriguez could only have dreamed of. In a way, Sarah's case stands as a monument to a bygone era of investigation, a stark reminder of how a cunning killer could exploit the system's limitations. Her story underscores the immense value of the technology that now helps unmask predators before they can bring their violent fantasies to life. Ultimately, Sarah Mitchell's legacy is one of remembrance and awareness, She was a devoted mother, a kind friend, a woman whose life was defined by love and responsibility until it was hijacked by a man's delusional obsession. Her story is a powerful reminder that we must listen to victims, that we must take threats seriously, and that the fight for justice is not just about punishing perpetrators but about preventing the crime from happening in the first place. Sarah deserved to watch her son grow up. She deserved a life of peace and happiness. While that was stolen from her, her memory endures as a solemn, guiding light, illuminating a path toward a safer world for all who have ever been watched from the shadows.